I want to thank everyone at Apex Art who took a chance on an exhibition outside of maybe the stuff they've done before and allowed us to do this in this beautiful space. And I just want to talk a little bit about my relationship with Apex, how this show came to be, and my relationship with Josh. And I should say, curator is not a title that I hold in this show. I really just was a talent spotter. Josh is, JD, excuse me, is very much the curator here. So I learned about Apex Art. I was nominated for their outbound resident program to go to Korea many years ago now. And for those of you who don't know about their outbound residency program, I highly recommend checking it out on their website. A life-changing experience. And since then, I've retained a relationship with many people on the staff. And that's how the show came to be, as Stephen invited us to fill the space. And I had been in conversation with JD Powe, who had just finished his first book about his incredible taxidermy collection, which as I've known him has grown from something that was already very impressive to being something that is more like standalone museum of its. This exhibition is only the very tiny tip of the iceberg of Josh's incredible collection. So, and I met Josh, I should say. He came into the Morbid Anatomy Museum. So we used to run a museum a long time ago. And Josh came in and told us that he had in his possession one of the most coveted pieces of taxidermy in the world that I had been unable to track down, which was Walter Potter's Kitten Wedding. And that relationship with Josh ultimately ended with him joining the museum as our board of directors, one of our board of directors, and also doing our final exhibition at the museum dedicated to taxidermy, which had as its centerpiece Walter Potter's Kitten's Wedding. And if you're interested in that, there will be an upcoming event with Ronnie Thomas with a film about Walter Potter, which will tell you more about this unforgettable Victorian taxidermist. I won't go into it anymore. But I just want to say something at Morbid Anatomy that was always very important to us is private collectors. And part of this is because as a non-accredited museum without proper climate controls and security, we couldn't really borrow from museums like the Metropolitan. But also, I would say that I know many private collectors, and I have found that they are as knowledgeable, if not more knowledgeable often, than the professional curators at museums who deal with these objects. They know so much about these objects. They bring so much expertise and so much passion. And so Josh is one of a few of these incredible collectors we know, and I'm very excited about the show, which is not just about the collections, but also about what it means to and what that I want to thank Apex Art so much for I can't wait, so to speak.
Thank you, Joanna. And over to you, JD.
Sure. Thanks, Joanna, for the introduction, and thanks to you, Maya. Certainly a very big thank you to both Morbid Anatomy and Apex Art for entertaining this madness. Happy to be here with all of you this afternoon, and thanks for joining. Joanna did mention in her introduction the first collaboration that I had with Morbid Anatomy, taxidermy exhibit called Art, Science, and Immortality. Seems like many years ago, but it was actually not that long ago, as it turns out. And I just want to mention a couple of things about that to kind of set the stage for what we're about to see today. With that exhibit, I tried to have a cross-section of different genres of taxidermy to try to dispel the notion that taxidermy was simply about sport-hunted trophies. So the sort of iconic deer head on the wall, that really is what comes to mind when most people think of taxidermy. And in that exhibit, I wanted to show a much greater depth and breadth of what taxidermy really is all about. So getting beyond that sport hunted trophy and getting into more exotic, rare specimens, extinct species, so-called freaks that might be a calf with 2 heads or a lamb with 8 legs. Even getting into some of the anthropomorphic style of taxidermy that really is kind of synonymous with sort of Victorian whimsy. And we're going to see some of that today. But I wanted to do something different this time around. Instead of that level of breadth, I wanted to go a little bit deeper. And in a sense, it's a more personal journey. It is about sort of my evolution as a collector and sort of the increased editorial focus that I believe happens over time. And it's certainly not just about me. I've had the opportunity and the joy to network and get to know many collectors, both in the realm of taxidermy and beyond. And I do believe that process of sort of a winnowing, a more highly focused attention to particular areas, to particular subgenres, or sub-collections within an overall collection is something that I really wanted to bring forward in this exhibit. So that being said, I think we can open it up and begin the tour. Now, before we officially start, I did want to read just the opening paragraph from the essay that sort of supports this exhibit, which is on the Apex Art website. And I'll just take a moment to read that. And in that opening paragraph, I write, "There is a particular type of joy reserved only for the dedicated collector. Fueled by a passion that borders on addiction, the need to pursue, possess, and preserve transforms the afflicted individual into a state of being that is at once both primitive and transcendent." And I'll just let that marinate just for a moment, because I think it really is the underpinning of what we're going to see today. And it is certainly something that on a personal level, that sense of conflict, of yin and yang, the joy and the exhilaration of collecting, of finding that rare item and adding it to your collection, also very much is part and parcel of this form of addiction that in some ways borders on the pathological. And walking that line, understanding the difference and trying to define that borderline between collecting because you can and collecting because you must, you are compelled to do so. And without having that exhilaration in terms of finding that next object, you feel less than, you feel impoverished intellectually, emotionally, and otherwise. So a lot of that really is the sort of foundation of what we're going to see. The first piece here that I'll mention, it's a greater kudu, and in many ways, it is sort of standard fare. This is the sort of iconic form of taxidermy that anyone who's ever heard the word probably conjures up at the mention of it. It's not a deer, but it certainly is an African analog to a deer, and it really is included here because it's the first piece of taxidermy that I ever acquired as a collector. And that was about 15 years ago. I encountered it in a very small, somewhat nondescript antique barn that mostly was filled with furniture. This was in the Catskills. And I had a passing interest in taxidermy at the time, but really I was interested in history, in antiques, in objects that had character more generally. But something about this piece, I think the fact that it appeared so majestic, so powerful, and so wise, even though so clearly dead and inanimate, was so compelling to me. And I was mesmerized, candidly. I was transfixed by the glass eyes of this greater kudu. And while I probably told myself otherwise at the time and sort of browsed through the antique store as if I had sort of a deep interest in, chairs, furniture, other sorts of objects that were there on display, there was no question in my mind that this kudu had found me as much as I found it, and it was ultimately going to come home with me. And that really was piece number one. Sometimes I call it the one as a result of that chance encounter. And I often think or speculate what would have happened if I had never visited the antique store on that day. Would I even be a taxidermy collector at all? I mean, it seems ridiculous in some ways to think that this one piece, as typical or prototypical as it is, could have spawned what I myself could have never imagined, and sort of a level of passion and enthusiasm and dedication to collecting and cultivating antique, vintage, and rare taxidermy examples could have started here. It's just kind of amazing to think what that alternative history might have looked like. All right, we can move on. So getting into the inner sanctum a little bit here. Yeah, we can start with the wall of fish. Let's do that. All right, so here are some of the favorites from my collection of antique and vintage fish specimens. And in many ways, again, this is really consistent with the idea of a collection within a collection. So a subgenre, a sub-collection. I think this is, again, something that happens over time as a collector sort of continues on the pathway, the journey of acquiring objects, the sort of tastes, the sensibilities often get more acute and more highly specialized. And I think this is an example of that. Obviously, there's a certain kind of taxidermy that people conjure up when they think about fish. Maybe that's the sort of kitschy Hawaii or Miami style fiberglass painted sailfish that you might see on a wall, or maybe a largemouth bass. More typically, these are kind of the typical fish forms that I think we're used to seeing. But obviously, as a collector, you have almost an insatiable thirst for the unusual. And over time, one of those areas of interest for me was really unusual fish. So you can see some examples of that here. There are examples by famed makers as well. So that also becomes a theme that is important, increasingly so as your tastes mature and evolve as a collector. The most probably famed represented here is the sort of British taxidermist Roland Ward, and there are a couple of pieces by Ward on this wall, including the centerpiece, which is a tigerfish, and at the upper left, a sort of hook-beak salmon. Both of those are pieces by Roland Ward, who was probably the most prolific and successful taxidermist of the Victorian age, based in Britain. So some of these species may be familiar from shows such as River Monsters as well. The Goliath tigerfish was kind of famously caught by Jeremy Wade on one of those programs. Both of those fish with the incredibly sharp teeth are examples of that species. You also have a wolffish on the bottom right, a Wells catfish, a pike, a parrotfish. The specific species in many ways are less important than I think the journey and the sort of concept of trying to carve out where your niche is going to be as a collector and trying to assemble them and display them en masse. So that's another theme that we're going to be revisiting quite a bit today. All right, let's move on. Maybe this wall with the crocodile shells. Thanks, Ryan. So this is an interesting one, and talk about niche or talk about obscure. This wall has 4 what typically are referred to as consoles or console shelves. So these are literally wall shelves, Victorian era, made from crocodile heads. And specifically, the 3 on the right are examples of gharials. So that's an Indian fish-eating crocodile, Gavialis gangeticus. So their name comes from the sacred Ganges River. And these specimens date from the British Raj period, essentially the colonial occupation of India, where gharials were sport hunted. And for whatever reasons, probably just the sort of awkwardness of displaying a very lengthy head out of sort of, instead of having it be perpendicular to the wall, they came up with this structure to have it be parallel to the wall so it could sit flat on the wall space and also form a sort of, or have a functional utility, that being a shelf. So this is as bizarre as it is, this was certainly something that was a fairly typical form for mounting and preserving crocodile heads. They're approximately, the larger ones are about 40 inches. So these are quite large, between 3 or 4 feet. I have a collection of these shelves that actually goes beyond what is shown here, perhaps bizarrely and unbelievably enough. On the far left is an Indian crocodile. That's a mugger crocodile, so different species. That's why they look different. The gharials, again, extremely rare nowadays. One of the world's rarest reptiles, obviously very much protected from an endangered species and a CITES standpoint. These are antiques, and therefore under the antique exemption, they are allowed to be privately owned. You'll also see some horse hooves on top of each shelf. In part, that was done to make the point that these are indeed shelves that are intended to have a functional purpose. We'll get into the horse hoof idea in more detail a little bit later. But this was also a popular form of remembering a fallen steed. So to preserve, protect, and otherwise memorialize a horse that may have died for posterity by working metal, silver, or brass, in some cases, around the hoof to create a functional object, whether that be a candlestick, a scale, as you can see in the middle, and this second one with the 2 rectangular objects, those are called vestas, so essentially for holding matches. All right, so we can move on. All right, let's take a look at the wall of feet, Ryan. All right, thank you. That's perfect. All right, so this is, as I just suggested, quite literally a wall of feet. Not your typical sport hunting trophy, but certainly something that in the 19th century, particularly in Europe, this was also a popular form of celebrating a successful hunt. So obviously the head of the animal, whether it was a stag or a fox or an otter, even a hare, that would also often be preserved. This was another way of essentially celebrating not just the animal and its sacrifice, but essentially time well spent in the pursuit of sport, as it might have been referred to then. So these feet on their various wooden plaques represent the feet of otters, of foxes, of hares, and of stags primarily. All of them are from England, and the plaques themselves, you can see that they have some writing on them. And that writing usually followed a sort of particular format as far as what it contained. And most typical were the place or the location where that animal drew its last breaths, as well as a date. And quite often you might have information that went a little bit beyond that, including initials representing the club name of the hounds that would have pursued that animal. So you would go out with a hunting party. That party would almost invariably have tracking hounds or dogs that would pursue these animals, and different breeds of dogs were specialized to track and hunt various types of small game or even larger game like a stag or a boar. And those initials for the hunting club would typically be represented on these plaques. In some cases, although this is much more rare, the individual that hunted or that shot the animal might be memorialized, or as part of the plaque might be named, but that's less typical. You might often see as well, and this is one of my favorites, the duration of the hunt. So where it began, where it ended, and the elapsed time. This is something that they actually kept track of and was often noted on these plaques. So how long the animal essentially was chased before it ultimately succumbed to either the hunter or the dogs in pursuit. One of the things more broadly that I'm attracted to, or that sort of drives me in this direction. And I'll say in full transparency, it was one that I initially rejected. And I think there are a lot of themes or a lot of subgenres here, including the dogs for that matter, that are similar in that way, that initially they held little appeal. I honestly didn't get it. Why would I would see these things? I never paid any particular attention to them because it seemed a bizarre thing to do. Why, how is that glorifying the animal? And why would one do that? I mean, obviously there's spatial constraints. The animals typically had four legs for the most part. So you could have 4 trophies, 4 mementos from a hunt as opposed to just the singular head. So there were certainly considerations along those lines. But I think over time, what I rejected initially as being too mundane, too simplistic, became very central as sort of my tastes were refined over time. And I think part of that is really about appreciating some of the nuance of these very similar form factors. I think another part is just the idea that while individually, many of these forms are not particularly compelling, collectively and at scale, they form a very different picture. And I think you can see that on display here. The takeaway is that these are all similar objects, obviously variations, iterations on a very narrow theme, but ultimately all unique in their own way. And when you see them presented in this way, I think that comes across, at least to me, it does. And that becomes something that in and of itself is quite fascinating for the observer. And I think finally, it also is a sort of macabre testimony to exactly how many of these animals were hunted and ultimately sacrificed in pursuit of this so-called sport. I'm not a hunter myself. I've never hunted anything so much as a squirrel, really, in my life. But I certainly think that a scene like this does present a picture of these animals not just as individually hunted or singular objects, but certainly something that was much more a cultural phenomenon in the late 19th and up to really the mid 20th century. All right, so since we're still on this wall, I'll just finish it out to say that, like the feet, taxidermy pets were a category that as a collector, I initially found not only unappealing, but also borderline repulsive, discomforting, abhorrent even. It was something that I really struggled to understand, I think, with a sort of modern sensibility. How and why would one choose to not only preserve a pet in this way, but to essentially care for, acquire, or otherwise preserve someone else's pet in this manner. Nothing really, no animal is more familiar to humankind as dogs, and maybe to a lesser extent cats. So to me, these animals, pets more generally, had very little appeal. They were too commonplace, too familiar. And as an early stage collector, I was much more interested in exotic animals, whether it were aardvarks or even something more well-known like tigers, for example. Those were the animals that were worthy of pursuit, worthy of celebration, worthy of glorification, even though certainly now, from a hunting standpoint and a conservation standpoint, that would not be something that I would have personally embraced. So I came late to the party with respect to having an interest in dogs. And I think that came about when I realized that at some point in this journey, I would ultimately run out of species to collect that were sort of high on that list, that were really aspirational pieces. And that's not to say that I could collect every known species. I really didn't have that kind of an aspiration as a collector, but that there was sort of a diminishing returns scenario where as I collected more and more species, from an echidna to a duckbill platypus to a binturong, the joy that I was able to harness and sort of capture with each new acquisition diminished little by little after each one of those priority boxes was sort of checked. So with a sense of foreboding, I understood that that meant that I was going to have to look elsewhere if I were going to sustain my passion for collecting. And I really, at the time, didn't understand or wish to contemplate what would be the alternative. Could I just quit or go develop another hobby, do something else that would be totally different? And that was almost too terrifying to comprehend. So I embraced the idea of, well, what is it about dogs? What is it about pets? Is it that intimacy that really could be the driver of intrigue for me? And the fact that each one has such a unique look, a unique personality, to the extent that that comes through in the work of the taxidermist. So that's how, after initially being very put off by the very idea, I was able to sort of get over that hump and acquire one or two, and two became 5, and 5 became 10 and 20 and so forth. And really began to be very interested in celebrating each one for the unique story that they either tell or don't tell and leave to speculation. So we've established kind of a little vignette here with dogs sitting around some antique furniture. I'll just go into the corner very briefly because we haven't talked about that, and we're going to kind of revisit this one too. But yeah, Ryan, right there in the corner where you see the flattened dog on the floor. So we're going to get into a couple of other examples of taxidermy dogs, certainly a big theme of this exhibit. So you first saw the ones that were lifelike, positioned outside of cases, sort of free to roam, off leash, if you will. But in the corner here, there's a couple of other examples, and maybe a little, that's fine right there, tough to zero in on the 3D, but essentially that one at the bottom is maybe a bit of a spoiler, certainly one of the more arguably disturbing taxidermy forms, particularly when it comes to pets. So the dog skin rug, if you will. So I do have several examples of this in my collection. And obviously it's a form that we are familiar with in the context of predators like bears or even tigers, lions, and so forth, where preserving them in the style of a rug would be a fairly typical thing to do. Much harder to wrap your head around this and why an individual pet owner would embrace this kind of a form with a flattened dog and a modeled head. So that sort of peculiarity is what makes it intriguing to me. You also see 3 miniature dogs on pedestals there. This very tiny, diminutive examples date to the Victorian era. And essentially, the majority of these were most likely stillborn dogs or dogs that died at a very early age, puppies, in fact, but modeled to look like adult dogs by the taxidermist. So essentially as curiosities. And this was something that was put, in many cases, put on public display. The Great Exhibition in London in 1851 had one of these taxidermy dogs. And before, of course, the internet and before viral memes, you had a different means of communicating and sort of enjoying bizarre oddities. So as a form of entertainment, the tiny dog, particularly in an era where artificial selection and selective breeding was very much top of mind in Victorian times. So, and it was an era where a lot of these breeds were being established and refined, not just dogs, of course, but essentially all types of farm animals, chickens, rabbits, etc., that were being refined and modified through artificial selection. So the concept of having the world's tiniest dog, or a dog so small that it would be almost miraculous, noteworthy, and meme-worthy, very much part and parcel of the times and still inspires great curiosity and wonder today. Let's take a look at the wall of dogs, or the wall of dog heads, Ryan. So perhaps just slightly less disturbing in a way than the dog skin rug or dog heads. So these are examples of antique dog heads that, like the rug counterpart, or the rug counterpart, sort of beg the question of why would an owner do this? Why present the dog as if it were a sport hunted trophy? I think, from my perspective, that's not really the way that it would have been framed back in the era where most of these were created. This was not synonymous with the sport hunted trophy. It's come to be associated with that, but this form essentially was a way to glorify the animal, to celebrate its life, its prowess and its majesty. And dogs obviously weren't sport hunted, weren't killed for the purposes of taxidermy, at least for the most part, but were celebrated in a form that today, with our sort of presentist lens, is very much associated with the sport hunted trophy. And that's why seeing a sort of disembodied dog head is a bit of a gut-wrenching experience, let alone to see more than 20 at the same time. So these represent different breeds, some of which are named and have dates on them. There is a rather famous bulldog on this wall named the Primrose Dame. Let's see, I don't know if we can have time to, it's towards right there, you got it, Ryan. So that's a piece also by the famed taxidermist Roland Ward, sort of right there to the left of the Newfoundland. That dates to about 1916. And just, I love the irony of the name. I mean, Primrose Dame, and this is a dog that really looks like nothing to do with roses, let alone a dame. But here we are. So again, this was another way of essentially celebrating and glorifying a dog that had become a very beloved member of the family for the most part, and keeping it for posterity. It's not clear to me whether owners at the time realized in any sort of visceral way whether these dogs would outlive themselves, right? And outlive in the metaphorical sense. I mean, what would happen when the owners died? What did they expect would become of these dogs? Would they simply be family heirlooms? Would they be thrown away? Did it even matter? I think those are questions that are worth thinking about and contemplating. I'm sure that most owners probably would be bewildered at the idea that some of these specimens lived on, if you will, for more than 200 years after their owners themselves passed on. All right, Ryan, let's take a look at the table while we're here. All right, so this table continues the variations on a theme idea, and specifically in the area of feet. This is comprised of another sort of subgenre of my taxidermy foot collection. Most of these are also functional objects, almost all of them. And these also include brooches, candlesticks, desk tidies. What else do we have here? Page turners, letter openers, button hooks. I think I've covered most of the categories there, and include the feet of otters, of badgers, of hares, of foxes. Perhaps most notably, there is a kangaroo foot here, as well as two dog feet that are in the mix here. One that was a gift of the Empress of Germany to her husband that came from a beloved greyhound that was a family pet. That's the one in the bottom left with the wooden handle. That's a page turner right there. And then the kangaroo is two up from that. So again, I think individually, I've not a category that necessarily and inherently is very impressive if you were just to find one of these. I've actually found these in the US at flea markets, maybe in some cases for as little as $20. They don't look like much, almost like a lucky rabbit's foot. But again, to see them collected in this way and assembled in mass, I think there's a very different takeaway there. And I think from the standpoint of that idea that you can have things that are similar yet distinctive, and also show the enormity of this practice and the breadth of it as a cultural phenomenon in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in England. I mean, this is really just represents, as Joanna said, the tip of the iceberg, not because, not from my collection specifically, but when you extrapolate what I have been able to acquire as a single collector over just the course of a couple of years, how many animals were preserved in this way, it really is quite astounding to contemplate. All right, let's move on. Let's take a look at the wall of dogs. So another wall of dogs here. You know, this one was inspired by an exhibit that, well, the first exhibit that I referenced that was a collaboration with Morbid Anatomy, where the very first wall of dogs, I believe, on public display was built, mostly Victorian era cases, so late 1800s up to probably mid 1900s on some of these cases. You can see a couple of cats have snuck in there as well. But this was another popular way of preserving and memorializing a beloved pet. And you see different examples and permutations of that, from some very tiny dogs to some quite large ones, a sort of curly-haired retriever on the bottom. You've got Yorkshire Terriers and Spaniels of various types, even have what looks like a collie on the bottom right. Some King Charles Spaniels, maybe a Tibetan Spaniel in the center. I'm not an expert on dogs, just to be clear. So my interest in this area really has nothing to do with the love of dogs per se. I have dogs and have certainly grown up with them, but this is really kind of a different thing. And the interest and the passion that I have for this really is more about the sort of exploration of the process of memorializing and preserving these antiques long after the demise of their original owners. And the fact that it is in such conflict with modern day sensibilities, where most people would reject the idea of preserving their pet through taxidermy or find it rather abhorrent. It's changing to some degree, and there's certainly exceptions to that. Yet we embrace the idea of cremation and essentially holding on to our loved ones, whether they are human or animal, and preserving them in an urn, for example, on the mantle or on top of the fireplace. That somehow is appropriate or considered appropriate, and not very strange at all. Whereas more lifelike effigies of these animals preserved using the sort of leading technologies of the time, very much a different story. Let's briefly turn to the left, Ryan. So just a couple other examples here on the wall. There's a couple of miniature dogs on the right. We can kind of start there, and there's an X-ray of one of these dogs that shows the animal's actual skull, as well as the wire armature that is used to essentially create a faux skeleton that the taxidermist builds around. And that X-ray represents the tiny, tiny white and tan dog on the bottom left of that diorama on the right, which is created to include very small sort of farmyard type birds, about the size of a sparrow, including some butterflies at the very top to give you a sense of scale. So these, again, were designed to really inspire awe and curiosity in the sort of pre-television, pre-internet era. And much later on, that piece was X-rayed, so onlookers could get a sense of what is sort of behind the scenes, what makes up the structure of these dogs. You also see a dog in a bubble dome there, a wall dome, as it's sometimes called. Certainly glass vitrines in the Victorian era were a popular way of preserving and displaying taxidermy, both from a functional standpoint in the sense that it kept away insects, excessive moisture and humidity that tended to create a longer shelf life for the specimen, certainly kept dust off of the specimen as well. That is one example of that category from my collection. All right, let's take a look at the horse hooves. All right, so here we have a collection of horse hooves also preserved as functional objects. And again, another variation on a very attenuated and narrow theme to make the point that taxidermy was really not just about hunting. It wasn't always about conquest and domination over the natural world. And certainly it's been portrayed like that in a lot of books, and not wrongly, but certainly that picture is a little bit too simplistic in my view, that it was also appropriated as a kind of a form of these mementos of life and of death in Victorian times and beyond. And this example of approximately, I don't know, maybe there are about 30 horse hooves here, all fashioned into different functional objects, including inkwells, ashtrays, vestas, candlesticks, pin cushions even. There was an attempt to say, not only do we want to celebrate this animal, we want to create a utility around it, and we want to preserve it, again, for posterity, for ourselves, as a way to tell the story of the animal. And you can't really see it here, but almost all of these are engraved with the horse's name, and in some cases, a story about the horse, how it died, what it was famous for. Was it a racehorse? Was it a jumper? Was it a hunter? One of them was even killed by lightning. So you have examples in an attempt to almost like an obituary for a human, memorialize and celebrate that animal in a way that probably would be unexpected if you know, were just thinking about taxidermy in its most sort of traditional representation as, let's say, the head of a deer or the head of a fox that succumbed ultimately to the domination of man versus nature, so to speak. All right, last category here that I've chosen to feature as part of this exhibit, the anthropomorphic category. And there are several different examples. This was another area that I mentioned, and almost all of these, I think, kind of call to mind the sort of biblical sentiment or I guess adage of the stone that the builder refuses becoming the head cornerstone. I think that comes from Psalms 118. And essentially what I mean by that is that all of these categories I initially rejected as sort of the builder or the mason, and ultimately now have become central to my collecting focus. So there has been almost a total 360, because I've come to appreciate what makes these pieces special and different. So on the upper left, just very briefly, you've got a pair of frogs playing dominoes in a sort of an elaborate wooden case. That's the one that's hung on the wall. And very often in the tradition of Walter Potter, although he certainly didn't invent this genre, he did a lot to popularize it. Joanna mentioned the Kitten's Wedding, one of his more famous pieces. And I did notice that we have the owner of the Kitten's Wedding that has joined us for this, Miss Sabrina Hanson, another very dedicated collector. So hi, Sabrina, I know you're out there. So often these types of pieces were designed to portray animals in human form, very simply, and often engaged in tasks that were or thought to be uniquely human, and almost by definition are uniquely human. And that's what really added a touch of whimsy to this. Why was this done? I think, well, again, I think part of it was inspiring curiosity. Part of it, I think, really tapped into some of the same themes as what I referred to earlier, the idea that this was almost like an early version of the viral meme, in the sense that people talked about it. It was different, it was unexpected, it was bizarre, it was curious, and it tapped into that innate need, I think, that humans have to wonder and to speculate. And I think this is a kind of a classic example of that. Moving to the right, you've got a series of 4 cases. These have royal provenance and are at least purportedly from Sandringham Castle in England, and may have been owned by the Queen of England herself and possibly commissioned by the Queen. This was a style of anthropomorphic taxidermy, not just a style, but almost like, again, I hate to keep using the word meme, but boxing animals, and particularly boxing squirrels, were a thing back then, unbelievably enough. So this is not a singular example, although it is the most ornate that I have seen. Normally, these are in very plain dioramas or boxes, but this one with the elaborately turned columns, something that suggests more of a higher end presentation. There were many taxidermists that did these. I don't, at this point, haven't been able to identify or definitively identify the maker of this group of 4. But what you can see is that they tell a story, almost in the style of a graphic novel. On the far left, you've got the sort of opening bell. The squirrels are meeting one another, shaking hands, and kind of getting ready to go. The fight begins. They're sort of getting into it, mixing it up a little bit. And then in the third case, sometimes there are 5 in this kind of scenario, but in this case, there are 4. A knockout blow. So you can see one squirrel clearly off balance, and then finally he's picking himself up dejectedly off the canvas, or off the wood in this case, while the other squirrel, in a self-satisfied way, stands kind of leering down at his vanquished opponent. So again, this was a popular theme dating back to at least the 1850s, where a taxidermist named Edward Hart was one to popularize this, and showed off a similar collection at London's Great Exhibition in 1851, where many, many thousands of people from around the world came to see it, as well as other scientific and artistic marvels that were on display. Finally, here you have a similar scene, but in this case, squirrels engaged in a heated game of chess. So just another example of that sort of whimsical anthropomorphic genre, where I think clearly the intent was to tell a story, to bridge the gap between animals and humans in a fun and sort of playful way. And again, I think to kind of tap into sort of a narrative structure that would allow communication and sort of spread proliferation of the ideas and the sort of fanciful approach that is sort of inherent to this sort of style of taxidermy. All right. Finally, I think we have one more. All right, so this is a bit of a stack, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to concentrate on the dog that is in the glass case here. And I'll just say that not the most attractive dog in the world, and certainly not the most attractive in the collection or in the exhibit that's on display here. But I think this one is unique and holds sort of a special place in my heart. And that's because, unlike most of the examples that we've seen, this particular one has a story that comes with it. And it's not unique in that respect entirely, but it is rare to have aspects of the story preserved or communicated across the multiple generations. And this one is going back to the mid-1850s. You can see a small piece of paper to the bottom left of it, and then a hand-stitched sort of embroidery. And the paper, to paraphrase it, says that this dog was stoned to death in the 1850s by a group of marauding children. And the embroidered patch next to it that, again, miraculously has been preserved, across all those many, many generations, says, "O thou brutish person, thou, to kill a dog like me, leave him to the judgment day, and rewarded he will be." So a sort of disturbing karmic threat of retribution there, essentially saying that the dog ultimately will be vindicated, and that those who perpetrated this horrible act of murder will ultimately get their comeuppance in the afterlife when judgment is ultimately rendered. And I chose that one to end with, not because I want to make everyone depressed. It is clearly a sad story, but the idea of the narrative, the story that's associated with these pieces, we so often don't get to touch or to experience or to feel because it's lost. It's lost to time, and across many generations, those stories have become very fleeting. They've diffused into the ether, and you just you don't generally get to have that level of detail. So I think it does need to be celebrated. But that said, I think all of the pieces in this exhibit are interesting, both for what we know about them and for what we don't know about them, for the stories and the meaning that we construct around them, for how they influence us to think about life and sort of what it means to construct meaning by collecting objects, if you are a collector, or by viewing objects, if you're not, and ultimately death, what it means to celebrate death and to hold it in the proper place of esteem, to think about our own mortality and also the morality with respect to treating animals and the natural world more generally. And with that, I will end it, and thank you for your time and your interest. Thanks, everyone.
Wow, Josh, thank you so much. It's always incredible to see your collection, and it's like to hear you speak at such length about these pieces is really quite something. And the exhibition design is just exquisite. So I'm so excited and so happy for you, proud of you, and it's great. We've got a number of questions from the audience, and please feel free to continue to put questions in the chat if anyone has any. The first is, someone says, "It's amazing how well preserved the examples are. What are the animals actually stuffed with, and how long would the process take?"
Yeah, so it's a good question. And the answer is it varies. So depending on the era, the specific techniques of the maker, they might be stuffed with different things. In modern times, most taxidermy is stuffed, so to speak, using commercial forms, so foam or maybe even fiberglass, where the actual skin of the animal is preserved, sort of tanned, similar to leather, and then ultimately wrapped around the body. In these cases, many of them are stuffed with other materials. They may have a wooden structure. They may be stuffed with wood wool or sawdust. Wood wool is almost like sort of like a straw-like substance, but it's kind of made from wood, and it's almost like string, and it's wrapped around a wire or maybe a wooden form. Sometimes there's plaster then that is coated with that to hold it into place. So it does vary. The process of doing it could take probably several days or more, depending on how you count, but certainly there are aspects of preserving the skin, building the form, etc. So it kind of really just kind of depends on what techniques you're using. In modern times also, taxidermy pets are often freeze-dried as well. So that's kind of a different technique where they're sort of, a lot of the interior substance is preserved and sort of, you're not preserving just the skin. So that's another way that people have found to create these at a greater level of scale, efficiency, and lower the cost. But a lot of different ways to create these. Some are even filled with sawdust. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Great. Another question: if prepared correctly, how long can a piece of taxidermy last? 100 years, 1,000 years?
And again, a really good question. And I don't know the answer to it. I'm not sure that anyone really knows the answer to it because no one has lived that long. Again, I think that's part of the irony of some of this is that almost all of these have outlived, in the metaphorical sense, their owners or the hunters that ultimately subdued them. So I'm not sure that we know, but certainly I would guess several hundred years potentially or more. There are dogs on display here that date to around 1850 or just a little bit earlier. So that's almost 200 years without any signs or any meaningful signs of degradation whatsoever. So, you could speculate, could they last another 100, 200, 300 years? In the right conditions, I would say quite possibly yes.
Okay, so when you first started collecting, how were you finding the pieces? I assume once your amazing collection grew, it became easier as you had more contacts in your network.
Yeah, another good question. I think initially I started with what I could easily find that was sort of in my immediate area, and that was simple things like eBay, Craigslist, even flea markets, tag sales. And it was sort of catch as a cat can, ad hoc, wherever I might find something. But it's certainly true that over time, as I acquired more and more, the threshold was reset for what I needed to acquire in order to kind of meet that bar of what was interesting to me. So whereas maybe a deer that might be very typical of form, might have been interesting to me 15 years ago, over time, that became less so, although I like to think I have an appreciation for almost any form of taxidermy. So certainly having a network and becoming very friendly, in some cases very good friends with many of the members of that network of fellow enthusiasts has helped to grow my collection. And that network over time became an international one where I was able to source and acquire pieces that are sort of in line with the specific genres that I collect. And people ultimately came to proactively seek me out if they found such a piece as sort of word of my collection grew. And I think that's fairly typical in terms of how these things evolve, that you become more specialized and ultimately it does become easier. The pieces come to you more than you have to proactively seek them out.
Okay, we have another question. Somebody says, I'm curious to know more about your relationship with each item in your collection. You seem to know a lot about the history of each object, location, genus, species, culture around its capture / taxidermy. Does this research happen before or after the acquisition? And do you still get excited about acquiring individual pieces, or do you see new acquisitions as just adding to a more important whole of the collection? And how long has this collection been in the making?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm not quite sure where to begin, but just to take a stab at it. Yeah, and I think, so first of all, I do get excited with each new acquisition. So I haven't lost that, although I do have a pervasive fear of losing that excitement. And I think that's why some of what I mentioned earlier in the sort of tour, this idea that I would get to a point where I either couldn't acquire any new species because it was just impractical, or it no longer had the same it no longer conferred the same level of joy and excitement. So that was something that I was legitimately fearful of. So I think part of that led me to explore these sub collections, or these more specific areas like the taxidermy feet, where I almost am able to cultivate an endless sense of joy by acquiring new ones because they are all so unique. And in some cases, I do the research in advance, but mostly I do it after the fact. In all candor, I'll bring something in and try to find out more about it. But as the person that asked the question, I think, was intimating, they do become part of a greater whole. So I think it is a scenario where the adage, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, certainly I think is on material display here in the sense of, just one otter paw, just one foot of a fox or one horse hoof doesn't really mean very much out of context. But when you look at it as sort of a broader cultural practice and see it presented in this way, it seems to endow it with a power that even a singular object can't quite match up to.
Okay, another question. Did any of these pieces come in the beautiful display cases that we see here, or did that require a search of its own?
Yeah, so most of the display cases that you see, I mean, I assume you're talking about mostly the dogs. So most of those cases are original, and they came in those cases. Some of them have been restored. But a lot of that and the vast majority is original condition. So I didn't have to do anything to source those cases. The white cases that are the floor displays were custom built. That's probably obvious. So thanks to Ryan for his craftsmanship on those. But the majority of these cases are original. This one with the final dog is an antique case, but the dog was not original to the case. It just happened to fit rather well.
Okay, another question. Josh, have you ever been interested in doing taxidermy yourself?
Really a good question there. I would say my interest in actually doing it myself is a passing interest at best. I think that level of what I would perceive to be gore, the blood and guts of it, not something that is terribly appealing to me. Although I think at some point it's probably inevitable that I will learn how to do it simply for the sake of saying I know how. So I appreciate it from that standpoint, but it hasn't really been a particular focus or a priority. I think in part because of my interest in the history as much as the science. And certainly, going back into this age, the late 19th century, where it was such an active and vibrant period of discovery, when even the theory of evolution itself was being formulated, I think, that I have a certain nostalgia for that period of history and the sense of wonder that I think abounded at that point, whereas now, so many things are really just known quantities at this point. And that's not to say that there aren't interesting things left to discover, but we are sort of living in the world of the verifiable fact as opposed to this sort of broad-based landscape where there was just so much of the world was unknown and uncharted. So I'm interested in it as much for the historical aspects of it as sort of the scientific aspects of the preparation and the individual techniques that are used.
Another question, were these pieces typically on display in people's homes, mostly in living rooms, and were they meant to spur discussion?
Good question. I think some of them were meant to spur discussion. Others were not. That may seem kind of like maybe a cop-out. I think some of it was just sort of, if you're thinking about a taxidermy dog, I don't, at the time, it wouldn't have been something that would be designed to inspire shock or awe, and it wasn't in conflict with sensibilities around sort of embracing death itself and sort of an intimacy with death that was probably, undoubtedly more typical and commonplace in the Victorian era than it is today. And if you think about, traditions, whether it's post-mortem photography of a baby, for example, that might be a cabinet card, or mourning hair displays that were made out of human hair to sort of celebrate family members and commemorate their lives. These were not things that were intended to be provocative per se. I think it was really more to create and support a sense of intimacy, of respect, and admiration. So I would say there probably are some exceptions to that. The miniature dogs, I think, were very much intended to inspire awe and wonder, and were designed to be provocative. I think certainly some of the anthropomorphic taxidermy had that aspect to it, that it was more of a curiosity that was designed to inspire conversation. And, you know, that I think it was undoubtedly part of the motivation for doing it in the first place. But other things like, you know, the gharials, the fish, not necessarily intended to inspire conversation or wonder. It was just something that was consistent, I think, with the times, and with, I think, an increasing desire to bring the outside in, to bring nature close to the home, particularly, as I said, in this age of wonder. It was sort of, some of it was a testament to the individual's worldliness, to their knowledge, to their, in some cases, their wealth, in their ability to be able to source these things and bring them into the home. And even for those that weren't necessarily wealthy, at the time, there was a taxidermist in almost every provincial town in England. So, you know, you could go in and buy decor and bring it into the home during this period. So, you know, I think it was almost like buying a decorative plant or something like that, not necessarily designed, again, to be provocative or disruptive, but something that was really a hallmark of the times, to show a sense of worldliness and sensibility that I think was consistent with the idea of empire and of dominion and power.
Well said, Josh. Okay, we have one final question. One listener says, I'm often torn between absolute fascination and horror when I think of the cruelty that is associated with many of the body parts. So many lives were taken. How do you feel about this? And what part do ethics or morality play for you when it comes to taxidermy?
Well, I think it's a fundamental question, and one that I think, one that I grapple with on a regular basis as someone who, you know, is obviously a dedicated collector, but also, you know, in some ways an enthusiast, and not explicitly a promoter, but someone who is an advocate for the preservation of these pieces because of their historical value. So I think the morality, the question of morality really kind of, you know, is central to the sort of whole process, in the sense that I'm not a hunter. As I said, I don't sort of advocate the killing of animals for sport. But it is very clear that obviously that still goes on today. And part of what I'm trying to do here, obviously this doesn't apply to the pets, which were not sport hunted. These died of natural causes and were preserved. So I think in some ways, a lot of what's on display here is exempt from that moral question. But I think if we turn our attention just briefly to, let's say, the wall of feet, I think part of what I'm trying to do there is explicitly show or hint at the scale that this was happening at. And again, I'm only one individual who's been collecting for a few years, going back about 15 years in total, but this foot collection started only about 5 years ago, and almost all of them came from England. So if you can imagine what I could have potentially accumulated had I started 20 years ago and lived in England, let alone how many were produced that I could never get my hands on. It is an astounding number of animals that were killed for sport. Unfortunately, a lot of them, like the European otter, now are protected, and a lot of that practice of sport hunting has stopped or been dramatically curtailed through legal advocacy. So I would say certainly I'm not supportive of hunting. I do want to make it clear when I'm producing an exhibit that this type of human predation occurred at a massive scale and continues today. But I would also say, and I think this is, you know, just maybe a different editorial note. I mean, for example, I mentioned the gharial. that Indian crocodile early in the discussion in the tour here. And their numbers plummeted far more rapidly after 1947, when the British were had sort of left India, versus that entire time from 1858 to 1947, where they were actively being hunted for sport. And that really is a question of technology, of habitat loss, of pollution in the Ganges River area and north of that, where these animals are endemic, that spread of population and pollution did far more damage than hunting. And it's a much more challenging problem to solve. And how do you balance the needs of humans versus the needs of animals? And it actually even inspired me to write probably a relatively bad poem about the jungle. And I'll mention it here in closing, which is here I'll give it a go. Beneath dark and sacred waters, the lizard queen doth lie, and in her ghastly countenance 10,000 teeth reside. But lo, the march of progress, two destinies collide. Now over her dominion, a naked ape presides. And I think that kind of sums it up with respect to the morality of what our responsibilities are to try to go out, protect and preserve these species, not just the dead ones, but perhaps more importantly, the living ones as well.
Bravo, Josh. Thank you. And thanks to Apex Art again for hosting this exhibition, this event, and for all of the beautiful work you've done. We're so grateful. Thank you. And thanks everyone who came.
Thank you so much, JD and Joanna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a whole bunch of lunchtime, 1 p.m. Wednesday events for this exhibition. Please go and take a look at the website. There's tons of information in the chat that we've been dropping, and come and see the exhibition here at Apex Art, 291 Church Street in Tribeca, New York City. And I hope that the virtual tour just gave you a little taste so that you can actually come and kind of look up close, because once you actually see the quality of these objects, they're really amazing. So please, we hope to see you again. And thank you again, everybody, for being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.